Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I hope everybody's feeling a little bit refreshed and ready for the next part of our event this morning. I'm going to hand over now to Chris, who is going to speak to us about the CANON project. Chris.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen for a second. That makes it a little bit easier to talk. I'm going to talk a little bit about the CANON project and with a focus on the database we are creating. The CANON project is a European project supported by Erasmus+. We have in total, we had 9 partners, but unfortunately 1 left. But we have the art school in Sweden, we have the theater technical school in Berlin, we have Rose Bruford, we have a school in Italy and 2 schools in Spain, and we have the Theatre Institute in the Czech Republic. These are our partners. The goal of the project is to increase awareness and understanding of the history of technical theatre in Europe from multiple perspectives. This multiple perspective part is really crucial in the sense that we discovered that if you look at the history from the point of view of different countries or different organizations, you start to see different things. And by bringing these together, you get a way stronger look at the history. It's a 3-year project. We have working meetings with teachers. We have working meetings with students where we go for 1 week to a country and we work very intensively together on developing new information or collecting existing information together about the history of technical theatre. And we have encounters with the sector, which of course during Corona was slightly problematic, but we're kind of starting to keep up now with our planning. What do? We do all kind of research on the history. We work online. We have student workshops and these theater workshops. Now, heritage for us is, I maybe not should explain that here so much, but everything that is not in use anymore. And some stuff seems very evident for us, like the machine you see on the side. For us, it's mostly clear what it is, but one of my students asked, isn't the picture upside down because the wheels are on top? So that's a bit how fast we go, which means that equipment that was 15 or 20 years ago, standard equipment in theater, is now really already into heritage. And wider, you could say it's everything that shaped our work, that kind of documents the way we worked, the way we made theater, the way theater was made. The project consists of 5 parts. The first one is the stories. We have teaching tools, methodology, the timeline, and the network. The stories is basically what we wanted to do is to create a canon, to create a series of stories that represent the whole history of technical theater, in the sense that things that you would expect everybody that works in the field that they would know. We divided on one hand the stories into 10 different fields, so sound, light, video, and so on. And on the other hand, we divided in 10 timelines, which is a challenge if you work with people from different countries, because we make an interpretation of these time frames rather differently. And the nice thing is you could just read the stories of one field, or you could read the stories of one time period, and you can use that as a teaching tool, but as well as an information tool, and so on. So that's one of the things that is in the last stage of development that will probably come out around December. The teaching tools are all kind of things that you can use to teach this history. What we noticed is that our students are getting more and more visual oriented and less text oriented. And it helps a lot to explain technical issues if you can visualize them, if you can make simulations, if you can show them in a way. One of the examples we've been working on for a long time is we took the Sabatini book and we literally went chapter by chapter over the descriptions on how the stage was built, and we tried to reconstruct the stage in a 3D model that in the future probably also would give the possibility to visit it, to walk through it into virtual reality. The methodology part is basically on how do we teach technical theater history, in the sense that next to the classical way of somebody standing in front and explaining everything they know, we're looking into how can we adapt to our audience. Typically, our audience are people that are more doers than readers. So that's one of the points that we start from to look more. And the idea is that it ends up with a practical inspiration guide, kind of a guide that tells you, okay, these are options that you can use into your classroom or your presentation sessions or whatever. The timeline is mainly a way of gathering information, bringing information together, visualizing it, and spreading it. We want it to become a collaborating tool and a safeguarding tool. I'm going to talk about that later in the presentation. And the last thing is what you're all part of now, because you're in this meeting. We try to create awareness. We try to bring interested partners together, and we want to reach out. And we want this network to become something long-lasting and collaborative. So let me go in depth a little bit into the CANON base, which is the timeline thing. The idea started in 2000 already, when I bought a gadget somewhere, which was a history meter. The year 2000 was a perfect moment of that. So there is 200 facts in there that kind of represent the history. It was a fun tool, but at the same time, it was an interesting learning tool. But it also showed us that bringing things in a time perspective, it helps a lot if you visualize that to understand the history. We worked with several versions. This was all before the project. We worked with several versions in classroom, where we let students put in historical fact they research into the different parts of the timeline. They started making all kind of little models to show that. And that was really a tool where you could work together with a group of 30, 40 people. You could all work together and still do your individual stuff. We've been experimenting with that in Belgium, but also in Sweden in a couple of schools. And later on, we also worked on that digitally when we started the CANON project. At that moment, we were not able to come together. So we created kind of a Miro board where students could work together and develop timelines and connect things together. To be clear, the CANON base is still a proof of concept. We started with a small version of a database, and based on research by doing, like we like it to do, we started to extend it bit by bit, changing the visualizations and so on. And one thing we realized very clearly, it will never be finished. Every day there is one day more of history, so there is more things to document, and every day we find new stuff that we want to integrate in that. So it's kind of a never-ending project, except for the funding, unfortunately. The goal of this database is to gather all kind of information about theater technical subjects, to link this information and to start to see relationships. In the sense, the moment you have all this information in separate bits of parts, sometimes it's hard to see relationships. And this database should help us to start to see new links, new relations, and so on. And an important thing is to structure the information in a way that we can visualize and organize it in different ways. After a lot of experiments with other systems, we ended up in what is called, in a very fashionable way, linked open data. To say it in a very simple way is, if you have information in all kinds of databases all over the world, and you can bring them together and you can link them to each other, at that moment you get way more richer information, and you have access to information that you don't produce yourself. I give a concrete example. We are interested in the technical history of theaters, but there is 2 brilliant websites about the more architectural and the more historical part of theaters. Instead of copying all this information, we just link to them. Now, to be able to do that, we need kind of a standardized data format. And basically, that's a technical translation of what Jim said earlier. Oh, it would be nice if we had a form to put all our information in a way that we all understand. Linked open data does that in a very extensive, but at the same time, very open way. Without going too much into technical details, is what they call a triplet structure, which means you have an item, a concept, an object, and you can add properties to that in a structure that is this item with this has this property, and that the property refers to a subject. On top of that, you can put in qualifiers some extra information. For the real technical details, we're working on a manual, but otherwise this would get very good. This is not a new thing in the sense that we all know Wikipedia, but there is also something like Wikidata, which is exactly doing using this structure as that we are using. In fact, we used their software and built a part on top of it. It has use advantages, but it also has some difficulties. There is no predefined data structure, which means for every item you start from scratch, which makes it a little bit difficult for non-experts. And there is a slight risk for chaos. On top of that, it doesn't has inverse properties. That's one of the things we developed in our system, which means if I say this theater has that architect, it doesn't show on the architect side. In our system, it does. And it's not really an end user interface in the sense that the basic database is just meant to connect things and for different people to put a layer on top of it. So that's a bit what we do. The idea of linked data is very nice, but how do you keep all these things synchronized? That's one of our big issues. Nice thing is we only collect essential information. That means everything that we need for the database to function, but everything that we can find somewhere else stays there and is maintained there. So we refer to them without putting everything in there. There is 2 exceptions. That is, if it's not available, if it's only available in books, for example, or if it's part of research we've done, at that moment we will add more information. And we will add information that is at risk. Or as a backup, in the sense that if we feel like we find this fantastic source of information, but we're worried that it will disappear, then probably we will put it into our database. One of the difficulties, it's very hard to keep scope because we're looking for technical information, but then we discover information about theater companies, organizations, and so on, and you're always challenged to put also all that in, but that was not scope. So that's a bit difficult. We're not documenting performances for some exceptions where they are technically so important or innovative that we add them, but it's not the idea to create a database with all the performances that have ever been played. Other people are working on that. And we're not putting real design in because that would bring us also too wide. This doesn't mean that in the future, if other organizations are interested, they could use the same system and just extend it with this type of information. Now, you could ask why didn't we work directly in the wiki database, which is a worldwide database that is used by a lot of people and maintained by a lot of people. Within the project, we decided not to do so because there the community sets the rules, and which slows down extremely the process of developing and trying new stuff out, because you get all kind of discussions. And in a 3-year project, the risk was too big that we would be slowed down too much. And secondly, the community, of course, as in every wiki project, can change or refuse information, which is fine if you have a worldwide database, and which makes it richer and makes the quality better. But within our project, that also would slow down things, or we would lose functionalities that we really wanted to keep. So for Canon base, we use the open data software. We shield it during the project from the community, but we hope to export what we do later on to Wikidata, or to enrich their information at least. And we had, by doing so, we had the possibility to add a lot of functionalities. We'll look at that in a very short. Now, during this time, we looked at a lot of information at risk. And this is not a typical thing for our sector. There is even archivists that talk about the risk for a digital dark age if we talk about the last 20-25 years. Let me make it with a simple example. If you have analog information, that's what we call a book. The tool you need to read that is an eye, and most of us have that, and eyes haven't changed for the last 2000 years. The readability of a book is quite long, even after 20, 30, 50 years. And we store books in multiple places, which makes that the chance that a book is completely lost everywhere is rather small. If you look at digital information, you need software and hardware. You have to permanently check the readability, because with all the updates there are, it's quite possible that a document that you made 10 years ago is not readable anymore. And you're rather working on central storage, which makes the risk of disappearing bigger, especially if you have, for example, a university drive system, a professor retires, and then at one moment somebody decides, oh, we can delay that because the guy is not working for us anymore. So that's the type of risks we're looking at. On top of that, there is something like digital degradation, and the fact that if you copy and copy and copy stuff, after a while, it becomes unreadable. Obsolete websites is a terrible thing, and you should have a look at all the websites we like to see about Roman theaters and all that type of stuff. And then you see last update was 2005 by, at that time already, Professor Emeritus, which probably means that at one moment they will shut that down and all this information will be lost. On top of that, I've seen some websites I used in the past that were unattended, so they were hacked and got all kind of interesting information, but from complete different fields. And the fact that, well, creators retire in the best case, or they die, makes that nobody takes care of them. And because it's not physical, it's rather easy to make it disappear. Before you throw away a book, you think 3 times. Shutting down a server takes 3 seconds. So that's kind of a thing. And then I'm only talking now about standard information, the way text and that type of stuff. But it gets even worse if you start to look at specialized information. 3D drawings, light plots, Q files. I have a lot of my light plots that were made in a specialized drawing program that I can't read anymore, for example. The fact that you don't have the software anymore, or you don't have the hardware for displaying it, to run the software on, that's another problem. So I think in the future we will lose a lot of this digital information. So what we did is we created a database structure where we try to organize chaos, but in a flexible way, in a not too strict way, so we can still tweak it depending on the needs. As I said before, it's basically items. We put in stuff, we give properties to these, and we link them to the internal and external part. That's the microstructure. To get a little bit of logic in what we did, we put every item on an axis system where on one hand it gives you the field, for example lighting. It gives you the type of information, for example it's a spotlight, and it gives you something on a timeline. For example, it is made in or it's first used in 1920. And you can do that for, you can use this for people, for theaters, for equipment, for methodologies, for sources, whatever. So in that sense, we create a little bit of structure that make it easier to find. To give you an idea, this is the fields we use. Most of them are really theater specific, but we also added, for example, general history, because that helps people in getting an idea of where in history things are. It's, if you say Second World War, people have an idea of where in history these things are happening. And in some case, the general history has influence on the theater. Just as we put general technology in there, the invention of a light bulb is not theater specific, but of course it's important for what we do. The types of information we collect can go over equipment, it can go over terminology, over theaters, persons, all kind of events that happened at one moment in time, sources and documents, organizations, manufacturers, and so on. So what we do is we split apart information that you would in a text all would put together, in the sense that you would say, okay, this equipment was made by this manufacturer and used by that organization, and we would all put that in one page, which makes it very difficult later on to get it organized. So we kind of pull the information a little bit apart, and then we link it back together. And the third part is that we have information that we use for visualizing. Dates to make timelines, geographical information to make maps. Now, to give you a concrete idea, if we talk about equipment, one of the things is we made a taxonomy, which is a thing that, to my big surprise, didn't exist at all. In museum taxonomies, they go more or less to the level of it's a lighting instrument, and that's where it stopped. But everything which is below is not described there, which of course makes it very difficult to have it. On the lowest level, you get what we call the generic type, which is, okay, that's an ADB Europe spotlight, for example. That's a generic type in the sense that there is a lot of them. And then we can connect, under that, we can connect collection pieces. So, for example, in my collection, there is one of these ADBs, and I connect that to the generic type. One of the nice things by doing that is that I only have to describe this generic type once. And then every collection in the world that wants can connect their specific spotlight to this generic type, which means you don't have to describe the whole spotlight. You don't have to describe all the information we have about it because that's already there. You only have to say, I have this spotlight and it has a broken lens, for example. The specifics for that unique type, but you don't need to describe this general type. Because everything is connected to everything, you see this one spotlight here. That's the generic type. That's the unique type, but it's also linked to the connection. So that means that if I look at this spotlight, I can see what else is there in the collection, or I can see which collections have this type of spotlight. I can have a look at the manufacturer. What else did he manufacture? If I look at the generic spotlight, I can go and look at the manuals, at publicity, at probably articles that were written about it. And that's all connected to this one spotlight. From the collection point of view, I can have pictures, I can have all kind of extra stuff. And on top of that, I can also see from the manufacturer, go one step further, who is the founder, what articles are written about this manufacturer, and so on. So that's a little bit, I know this is pretty abstract, but that's basically what we try to do, is split information into small parts, and by doing so, being able to connect them in a way that makes sense. Now, where do we get the information from? Is we've trying to be harvesting. Why? Because there is a lot of information there. Why would we recreate things that are already there? The problem is often it's hard to find. But we started looking into, for example, all kind of existing lists of theaters. We used digital theater words. We used sets of magazines from professional organizations. Of course, pictures that we find, online sources. And where possible, we go. I must say this is an old slide because it says we have 9,000 theaters. At the moment, I think we're already at 14,000. And terminology-wise, I think we're way over 2,500 terms now. Because what we do is we extract information from different parts and then we combine it so it becomes richer. And where possible, we use mass imports. In the way, if we can track down a long list, for example, that links to these websites or digital information or analog information, we try to mass import them, but where needed, we do it manually, which basically means that we kind of copy paste information into Excel files, and then we use these Excel files to import them. But there is always a manual check, and that's quite important in the way the idea that AI would be able to do this is, especially in our sector, not so easy, because a lot of theaters are called theater, the theater of this city, the theater of that city, and so on. Sometimes the company takes the name with them if they move to another theater. Sometimes theaters are called differently in different sources. So there is always a pretty big manual check you need to do to avoid doubles, to avoid lacks, and to avoid loss of information. Is this perfect? No, we always lose a bit of information. That's unavoidable. So for the theaters, for example, we retrieve lists of information, we clean them out. Then we add information that we need for the structure, which in the case of a theater would be, okay, the field is architecture, probably the type of information is a theater. We add dates, we add geographical information, and we add information about in which city and what address That makes it possible to structure all the information. At that moment, we match that with what we already have. So we see that there is not too much doubles, that the names are corrected, and then we upload the whole stuff, and then we check and clean it. What we've not experimented with a lot, we start doing that now, is crowdsourcing and checking. You can understand that checking 14,000 theaters is pretty hard. The thing is that I can rather well check Belgian theaters because I know them pretty well. It becomes pretty hard if I have to check, for example, Italian theaters or Finnish theaters. Because I don't speak the language, I can't go in depth to that. So what we would love to do in the future is to ask people, can you please check your city or your region and give us feedback to that, or update the information. And by that, it becomes a reasonable effort for everyone to do a little part, but in total, it would enrich the whole information. And then the last step is, which we of course not do for every theater, we go in depth, we research, and we enrich the information that was not available before. Information can come from a lot of different things, because if you have a theater, probably somebody has written a magazine article about that. We have some pictures. There is Cartalia, for example. Maybe somebody has collected stories from it. They have their archives. We have books. We have all kinds of catalogs of equipment, and often companies refer to the theaters they have installed. And on the other hand, we have collections and lists and organization, and we bring that all together. And in that way, we get a way richer set of information. Often in a general article, they just say the theater was built in 1920. While in more specialized information, then you find a date that is more exact, or you find a different building date from the opening date, and so on. So bit by bit, by bringing everything together, we enrich the information, but we don't need to start from scratch every time. We build on the work of other people. Magazines is another thing. We have scanned and OCR'd magazines. We also got whole collections, for example, from DTHG, gave us the whole thing. STEP gave us the whole, all their magazines that have been published in the past. We put them in a list on the level of articles, which means that you have the magazine as a whole, you have the different issues, and you have the articles. And we also have the writers. We upload the magazines more as a backup, and if they're not somewhere else, then we upload them as documents that we use. We import them and clean them, and that's the most important part, we add mentions to it. So we go to a magazine and say, okay, this article is about this company, and it describes this and this and this spotlight. This article is about this theater. This article is about the work of that person. We mention that, and then it links automatically to the other side. So if I mention my ADB spotlight I talked about earlier, the article will come in under the spotlight as a source. So in that way, we enrich again the information in both directions. If we talk about more traditional sources like books and so on, it's mainly manual input, in the sense in some cases we can extract indexes of lists, but all the rest has to be done manually. We upload backup documents if they are available, often everything which is from, let's say, before 1920s. There is a lot that we link to archive.org. Now, the nice thing is that if I have, can't remember what book this is, but it's a book that describes a lot of theaters with drawings. So we annotate them and we say, okay, this is on that page of the book, and it has plates in it. And then if you look at the object on the other side, it will give you all the sources. So in that way, it's a lot of work, but once it's done, it supports a lot of other functions. If we talk about equipment, some of the things where that are already online, we could do a mass import. Secondly, we have magazines, that is a lot of good information, and then technical documentation and manuals and that type of thing. One of the big issues that we have with technical equipment is that most of the documentation and the manuals are not dated. And we thought this is a strange thing, but talking to manufacturers, they say, yeah, but if I put a date on my technical documentation or my publicity, it means next year I'm selling old equipment. So that's why these magazines are becoming so important, because they are, of course, are dated. But equipment is mainly manual input or directly into the database or into first an Excel file that we import them. Okay? So this is a real typical thing that grows bit by bit organically by adding information. For terminology, Jerome did a fantastic thing. He gave me the theater words thing, the theater words list, and we used as the start of our taxonomy. In the sense, a lot of the terminology is about equipment. So we took out all the equipment and we kind of organized that in a way that is understandable for us. And we took all the other terminology that is in there and we divided that into the different fields that we're using also for the rest. That was the start. And then we started adding dictionaries. So we added different dictionaries in mass import. And sometimes when you find a word in a magazine that you think I should link to that and it doesn't exist, then it also comes into the terminology. So we built a kind of decent start, and then during the research it will add on, which also gives us kind of a controlled language that we hope that museums can be using in the future. I give you one concrete example from another field, costume, hair and makeup. What type of documentation did they use? They use plots, they use renderings, they use fabric constructions, and so on and so on. If every museum would be able to use these terms to describe what they have instead of documentation or paper, it would help us a lot to identify also what is in museums. So this controlled language is created by getting all this stuff together. You get a series of terms and you get a tree structure. What is more is we always talk about new theater words, but we also work on old theater words. So what we do is we add these different dictionaries. They are dated. So after a while you get from certain terminology, you can kind of more or less define when a term was first used or when a term disappeared. And in that sense, it helps a lot in researching, for example, occupations, that you see that at one moment it starts to mean something else or it disappears. We harvested a lot from digital collections. So there we try to get their list, we clean them again, we match them, and in that way you go directly to a digital collection. One of the difficult things is that if you just put a link to a collection and not to a specific item, it's very hard to find it back often in the more general collections. By developing these lists, you get on a specific spotlight directly a link to the different collections that have information about that. One of the problems we have is that often information is given in text, and text is very forgiving. because the writer assumes that we kind of make an interpretation, that we read something and that we put that in a context ourselves and so on. Now, databases are not so good in that. What's more is that it's sometimes very hard to find. Even museums and collections often just put stuff online in a way that it's not linkable or retrievable. They don't have lists in some, or they don't have ready-made lists, or they are not even available. And often they merge information. With simple example, if they put all the stage measurements together into one field, which makes it very hard in the future, for example, to research the evolution of the stage opening width. So that's one of the things that we try to solve, is to get the information in a way that it's readable, that is you can make an interpretation of it based on queries and that type of stuff, and that you can represent it in different ways. What we also see is that a lot of collections don't use URIs. The big difference, URL is a traditional website address, and then they change the website and everything, all your links are lost. While with URIs, you should be able to reconstruct them. And that's one of the big issues we have, is how do we keep links sustainable to everything which is not structured data. And it's even the worst websites are websites where you can't even link to, because you always get back to the original address. Other issues we have, if I take the concrete example, is when do we talk about a new theater? If a theater burned down and they rebuild it, is that a new theater or not? What do we call a theater, a cultural center, and so on? What do we do when a theater becomes a cinema, or a cinema becomes a theater, or a theater becomes a warehouse? How do we deal with this? Now, it's quite easy for us to make decisions on our own, but what we would love to do in the and we're working there together with another organization that is trying to index all the actual working theaters for different purposes, that we use the same terminology in order to be able to link everything together. And that's a big issue, is that a lack of taxonomy. We hope that in the future we can develop with other parties something together, that if we say it's a PC spotlight, that everybody understands what it is and what that exactly means. Because to be honest, we're pretty good in theater to use different words for the same thing, and the same word for different things. That doesn't help in making things understandable for a computer. So we hope well, we won't be able to finish it, but at least to give a good start on developing this taxonomy that can be used by other things. Often also there is a lack of accuracy in information. That has to do with the purpose of a text or whatever. But if we want to map and visualize and compare information, we need accurate information. I can't put a date which is more or less in the 60s. That's very difficult to put that on the right place in a timeline. People confuse opening dates with building dates. Sometimes they call the theater building, in fact, by the name of the company of the organization that is in there. What you see often in wars is that it says the theater is destroyed in the Second World War, but not on specific dates, which makes it very hard. Or it's built in Roman times, 1500 seats, and then you find other sources that say 1499, and the other one says 1520. So often there is, in the information we find, a lot of inaccuracy. As I said, sometimes essential information is missing, like dates in commercial documents. To my big surprise is that half of the information I find from buildings don't even mention the architects. So a lot of theaters write something in their on their website about their building, and they don't even mention the architect. Tagging is a big issue. This picture is a nice example. It's a picture from a play during 1914, if I remember well. No, not sure. Anyway, the picture is tagged with all the people that are on there, with the theater that it's in, but of course it doesn't tag that there is spotlights. Because nobody thinks that's an interesting thing, which makes it very difficult to find them back. Now we hope if we find them to add them and then get more into that. One of the issues we have is that often information is given from a different scope. If you make a list of theaters for programming purposes, you only are interested in the information now. You're not interested about the past. If your building is listed, probably you only give the information about the building, but not about the technology. A book about fires will talk about these theaters, but not necessarily give enough information, and so on and so on. And an issue that we all have is copyrights, especially because there is international differences. Some pictures I can use in Europe, but not in the States, for example. And there is different rules for education, research, and a larger audience. But of course, if I put something online, that becomes a little bit more difficult. We have one solution that some documents we put behind a login, which means that for education and research, they're available, but not for a larger audience, because that's the limitations of what they're doing. What we want to do is visualize stuff, and we do that in different ways. First thing is, I already showed a little bit of that, is creating tree structures, because people don't read long lists. They want to find quickly their information, but they're not going to go through a list of 300 things. An example is, for example, the theaters are divided by continent and the country. Then we now go a step further. We give the province and the city, and then you get a list of the theaters, which makes it way easier to find a theater than in, and it gives you also an idea about the amount. We also visualize them, so we put maps there where you can see where all the theaters are. In the future, we also hope to work with geomapping, georeferencing, so you could also see historical maps, and you could see how did this city look like in 1800 and what were the theaters that were there. That's one of the things that we didn't cover at the moment, but that we want to do. And then, of course, we have a timeline. One of the problems is that after a while, you get too much information. If I look at theaters and I would look at the full timeline of all the theaters, it becomes completely unreadable. So in that case, if we have too much information, we select, for example, only the opening and the closing dates and not all the dates in between. And the timeline looks then more or less like this. To be honest, it's not the most fancy timeline I've ever seen. But as this is a proof of concept, we're first looking at, can we make all the functionalities work? And then we hope in the next phase to, for example, have student projects in developing nicer timelines, so an IT school or something like that. For manufacturers, for example, we only put in the mainline start time, end time, but in the item time, so where you describe one manufacturer, you can give all the different significant dates of the company. We've been experimenting with word clouds, and that's a very complex issue because you're trying to gather all kind of different information in the same format, and that's not what databases are made for, but we're working on that. The idea is that if you have one item that you will see the architect and you will see the city, but then the architect will connect again to the other buildings he made. So in fact, you're kind of mapping the environment of one item to be able to see new relations. In the sense, this architect, you have an architect, he was regularly in one cafe, and then probably you will see 20 other artists that were also in the same cafe, and in that way you can start to see relations that are not typically in there. On the level of items, that's then another part of the project, but we also try to visualize things, to make 3D models, to make VR models, to make movies. This movie, for example, was made by the students in Spain, and they made an interpretation of the dialogues of the Sommi about lighting. And now there is a video in the database that, well, that makes it way nicer to do that. Filtering, typically you would make a traditional filter. Now the problem with the fact that we have very much different types of information means that you almost have to be a little bit of a programmer to be able to do that. You see on the right, you see how you can make these queries, but that's a little bit, well, that's not very practical for an average user. For us, it's useful, but for an average user, is that not so interesting? So what we did is we filtered basically on the items. Give you an idea, if I look at a country, I will see from that country, I will see the map, I will see the theaters that are there, I will see the timeline of that country, so including as well the theaters, the manufacturers, the people that live there, that work there, and so on. So in fact, you get kind of a standard filtering based on the subject you look at. So here I get all the information of a country, but then if I go to a field, for example, and I go to architecture, then I will see also the theaters that are in that country, but then organized in a different way. I will see architects, I will see text about this field, and so on. So where possible, we make all these filters and visualization in a way that you just scroll the website, you go through the website, and you see this information. For example, equipment will show you all the information organized by field, while the manufacturer will just show the spotlights they have. If you go to individual equipment, so now I'm talking about this, what we call the type of spotlight. There you get all the basic information, but you will also get all the manuals in different languages, the articles that are written about that, probably references in books that are made for this equipment. It will also show you the first use of something, and so on. And it will, and that's, I realize I didn't put that in the slide, it will also give you all the technical details. So it will tell you what's the size, what's the lens size, all that type of stuff. So it's basically, it's an open format, but it's standardized in the way that we can reuse that afterwards to filter, for example. You give a stupid example, you could say, give me all the spotlights that have a lens of 120 centimeters, and then you would get them all together, because we split the information up in a specific way. So you see first use. Now, how do we keep, because I talked about all these old people that are retiring or dying, and the information gets lost then, and then you see in front of you an old person that is already gray that decides to make a new website. In fact, the best way to keep it alive is to make it a common project, and a project that is used by a lot of different people, in the sense that well, people will contribute if they have a return for it. And I think that this database structure as it is can be used by researchers, while they on one hand use everything there we have, and on the other hand add information, and in that sense it becomes richer and stronger. But anyway, there is always a risk that you have to end a project. All the properties we build are returnable to Wikidata. Sometimes we call them differently, but you can always translate them in Wikidata properties, and then we could upload the whole base of information we have back to Wikidata. And that is quite, because it's supported by so many different people in so many different countries, it makes it rather sure that it will survive. The fact that we use linked open data also means that, for example, somebody else that makes a website can just retrieve information and drop it in his website. Imagine you have your own collection, you've put all your information in there. It should be possible to have on your own website just the selection of your information there with everything you have, but the information itself is in one place. And the fact that we get to a controlled vocabulary helps a lot in safeguarding, because then people start to understand what is where everywhere. If I look at the future, I think one of the things, this is a proof of concept in the way we worked 3 years. We tested a lot of stuff out. I think we have a reasonable good concept now, but we definitely need to improve the user experience as well, for the users as for the contributors, because it needs too much technical knowledge at the moment to be able to work with it, and we want to simplify it in a way that people can just add their information and don't have to think about all the technology. We want to improve, as I said before, the visualization. We want to improve media presence in the sense that there is so much things, so much theaters, for example, that have been scanned, that have been drawn in 3D and so on, and we would like to bring that all together so people can find it. And there is so much websites where you have this information and you just don't find it back. We also see that as probably making more tools for researchers, where they can have extra functionalities to do research. And one of the projects I would love to do with IT students is to make all kind of extra functionalities and applications. For example, it would be nice that every day you get a mail in your thing like, what happened today in history? Who was born? Who made the production? What was the opening night? What was the equipment? Something like a bit what BBC is doing with This Week in History, something like that, where you get kind of that type of information. Showing your own collection. One option could be location warnings. When you walk through a city, that it says, okay, in 100 meters from here, there is a theater that is worth looking at, or there is a collection that is interesting, or this thing happened there. That's one of the options. An app for adding information where you could just by phone take a picture of something you see and add the basic information and get that directly into that. And what I hope to do is extend the cooperation, probably also with new fields, because I showed you the 10 fields, but like for costume, the information is rather limited because that was not really our focus, but the costume commission was interested in adding stuff there. I would love to extend cooperation with collections and museums, because for example, for a museum, and you have 20 pieces of technical equipment, you can't put that as a focus on your website, which means that it kind of fades away a little bit between all the other stuff they have. While if they would link it to ours, it would become prominent into an application for specialists. As I said, we would love to have more contributors in the future once the project is over That's one of the things we need to work about, and extend the cooperation with Wikidata, which we're already doing now for the theaters, in finding a common language so it becomes exchangeable in both sides. And then the next step is, I think it's becomes more and more important that we also support people that are digitalizing information. There's a lot of people that are scanning documents and so on. If they could document that directly in a way that we can use it, it would help a lot. And it would help a lot to kind of create digitizing standards, that if you scan something, that it's in a format that we could present it afterwards and we could use it afterwards. So I hope that this leads to a permanent network that is active and that is based, I think, on mutual interest. So if you're interested, contact us. I hope it was not too long and not too technical.
Great, thank you, Chris. No, I think that was terrific, and a real kind of deep dive into some of the issues of building these databases, but also I think a real sense of what some of the potential is from having this kind of common platform that isn't about, you know, putting everything in it. It's about linking out to material that's already out there and providing that kind of an index, as it were, to what there is available. Fantastic. Before we move on to a slightly wider conversation, there are a couple of queries that were raised specifically in relation to the database, Chris, which perhaps you could address. The first one, which you covered a little bit, from Elias, who asked about copyright, but I think you didn't mention particularly copyright for things like magazine articles. But how's that being managed?
Yeah, well, the magazines we have in there now, they were public anyway, in the way they step as a policy where you agree as a writer, for example, that your article is published on, I think it's Issue or something like that. Digital Data HG did the same thing when they existed, I think, 111 years. So their magazines go back from 1907, I think it's the oldest one, and I think they have the same type of agreement with the writers. I must say, if we ask in most cases, and Peer de Want also is digital, so we link to their sites, but we have a backup copy in our thing. If ever something would happen with one of the digital collections, at least there is a copy.
Yeah,
that copy is not public. But it's kind of a safety measure. A lot of the sources we use, like books and so on, are from before 1920. And before 1920, there is no real copyright anymore.
Yeah.
So that helps. With collections, the moment the collection is put online by the museum, it's fine. Then you can link to it. The collection of postcards, for example, is free. So the idea is that where possible, we're just linking to existing information. The pictures we make ourselves, we make them open source, so that's not a problem. But it becomes more difficult to, if you have other pictures that you probably find online, and especially students are pretty good in finding pictures online and can't trace them back to. The only thing you can say is that we tried everything, but if there is an issue, please contact us. That's mainly, I think that's the main thing. But it is still a problem. For example, commercial publicity, I think, well, it has been online so much, but often it disappeared because companies don't want their old information there. There, I think we have a little bit of flexibility of, yes, we put that online, and if you have a problem with that, just let us know. I think that's a bit of fairness we need to have. But it's, in some cases, it's an issue. And then the only thing you can do is refer to it and say, yes, this exists somewhere, but you have to find out yourself. Well, what we do with more recent books, for example, is we we index them, we put that, but there we say, okay, it's you can buy that there, or you can well, just buy it. That's the limitation we have. More tricky is that some collections and museums now want to get money because they need money, as we all do. They try to get money from the pictures they put online, but luckily that's mainly when you publish, in the sense when you put it in a book, but in a digital platform in general, that's not so. But it is possible that there is a lawyer standing at my door now. I don't know.
Great, thanks, Chris. And the other question from Jerome was about regionalization within this. So obviously the question of languages and terminology, but also, and I know this is something we've discussed within the project, that, you know, if you say, oh, this is from the Renaissance period, well, that's a different period if you're talking about England than if you're talking about Italy. Yes.
Technically, it's possible to put an item in different time frames, strangely enough, in the sense the 10 time frames we developed are very general and are more or less, well, orient you but at the same time there is a time frame, Spanish Golden Age, which is really specific on the region. So we can have and then if you would look at Spanish Golden Age, you will only see what's happening in Spain, of course, while if you look at Renaissance, you would see the whole thing, including this. And that's one of the advantages you have with this type of data structure. Is addresses is a nice example. There is an address now where the building used to be, but at the time the building was there, it had another address because they changed the name of the street. What we can do is say, okay, this is the name of the street from that time till that time, and then from that time till that time it was called differently. And in that way, that gives you a lot of flexibility, but it also makes it complex to add stuff. And in the website is multilingual in the sense that we used English as a mother language because that's the mother language of the project, but you can put information in almost every language you want. So, and what's more, if you put the information in another language, you will, and it's put in English and you translate it in another language, you will see the both languages, and depending on how you're logged in, you will see the title in your language or the title in English. That's a bit the idea. So in that sense, it's multilingual. I'm not quite sure what happens if you're not starting from English, but you do things in another way. On the other hand, there is things that we don't translate. In the sense, we don't translate names of people, except if they're really used in a different way. We don't translate the names of theaters, except if the theater itself uses different names. And then we just copy them in all the other languages as they are, because it doesn't make sense to translate a name if they don't use the translation, because that doesn't make any sense. So it is absolutely possible to use whatever language you want to use. And the search function that is in there will literally look at all the languages at the same time. So in that sense, that helps a little bit.
Great.
Is that an answer to the question?
Yeah, I think so. Yes, I'm sure. I'm sure the question will come back if it isn't. Thanks.